On today's Film and Whiskey, we're looking at the state of American movies in the year 2021. Where do we go from here? And while we talk about that, we're going to be sipping on 3 whiskeys from the Smoke Wagon Bourbon Company. So stick around for Film and Whiskey. Hey everybody, welcome into the podcast. We are back with our first bonus episode of the season.
The first bonus episode of the season.
I didn't really help you out there, did I?
No, not at all.
Brad, it is good to be doing a bonus episode. We made a solemn vow to ourselves before we started season 4 that we were only going to do a max of 10 bonus episodes this season. We'll see how that goes. Last season, I felt like we were literally doing like one every other episode, and it was too much. It's just too much.
Yeah, man, we did, I would say, a metric ton of bonus episodes.
That's an accurate number. But we're back with one now. It's been long enough that I feel like we can finally release one. And Brad, lo and behold, our recording of this is lining up with the release of the Snyder Cut on HBO Max. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, but I mean, if you watch movies in 2021, you probably are at least somewhat aware. Zack Snyder is a director of American films. He is kind of the DC Comics universe guy to compete with the Marvel movies that are coming out now. He directed Man of Steel, he directed Batman vs. Superman, and they brought him on board at Warner Brothers to do Justice League. The movie kind of fell apart for a number of reasons, both personal and professional. They brought in Joss Whedon to kind of complete that movie. It turned into just a big mishmash and a mess of a movie. And ever since then, fans have been speculating that Zack Snyder has a cut of the movie that was going to be the best movie ever made. And so for years and years on the internet, it's been kind of a joke where you'd see a hashtag release the Snyder Cut. Well, actually, Zack Snyder did have a ton of material. And basically, people on Twitter bullied Warner Brothers into throwing $70 million into restoring Zack Snyder's original vision. And so what we've got now is a 4-hour cut of the Justice League movie that just premiered on HBO Max this week. I have not watched it, Brad. Honestly, I don't know if I want to watch it. And that's kind of what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about the state of American cinema today. And that's really going to come in the form of 3 questions that we've identified. And Brad, I've already been talking too long, so why don't you explain how we're going to break this down today?
Yeah, Bob, we're going to be talking today about 3 different aspects of American cinema that are really, I would say, dominating the talk space. That we talk about superheroes, we talk about streaming services, and we talk about movie theaters. And those may seem like 3 really broad categories, but in the midst of a, worldwide pandemic that has gripped, our nation and other nations, and people are fighting about whether or not we should go to movie theaters at all. These streaming giants have turned into absolute titans, right? That obviously they were already kind of taking over the world, but it feels like they just put the pedal to the metal in this off year for the movie theaters, and it's the Wild West. Everybody's coming out with their own streaming service. Everybody wants to capitalize on their own IP. And Bob, honestly, it just kind of feels crappy.
Yeah, totally agree. So we're going to talk about all 3 of these questions, the question of superhero movies, the question of streaming services, and the question of movie theaters, and whether or not we'll even get back to having movie theaters after this pandemic is over. And while we do that, we are going to sip on 3 whiskeys from the Smoke Wagon Company. Smoke Wagon, one of the hottest names in bourbon right now. They are a non-distilling producer. Well, I don't know if they're technically a non-distilling producer, Brad. They contract the production of their whiskey with MGP, and they are currently, as far as I know, also distilling some of their own product that they're kind of sitting on right now. So, the bourbon is sourced. I think that they're technically a distiller. So I don't really know how to categorize that. But in any case, the bourbon that they're putting in their bottles is flying off shelves right now. It's really, really hard to get. We were able to get 3 samples of 3 different kinds of their bourbon from the company themselves.
Bob is over here nitpicking about, is it an NDP or are they, what's going on here? And I'm just halfway through my second glass. Like, it's booze.
One of us has to do research, Brad. So we're going to be sipping on their straight bourbon, 92 proof, their small batch bourbon at 100 proof, and their uncut, unfiltered at 112 proof. Brad, let's get into talking about this, man. And I guess I'll put it to you first, and I'll put it to you like this. Are superhero movies ruining movies?
I don't know if movies will ever be ruined, right? Like when you, I feel like it's so easy in today's internet culture to just go for the throat on anything that frustrates you. And I'll be honest, superhero movies frustrate me. However, I don't think that it will destroy cinema. Like, you still have some truly amazing films come out. One of my favorite was one that came out right before the pandemic, which was Jojo Rabbit. You know, like, which I think Jojo Rabbit is a perfect movie to point towards to say that, like, big movies that are, like, artistic don't also have to be, like, art house films. Like, that movie is beautiful. It's funny. The content is deep and meaningful. And, like, honestly, there's some really good historical theology going on with, you know, the Jewish religion. And so, like, that is an absolutely spectacular movie that doesn't have to be super highbrow. I think it did decently well at the box office. But, like, that's a movie that I would say is, like, hope for the future. However, when you look at what has dominated, just utterly destroyed everything else at the box office over, honestly, the last decade, like, when you look at the growth of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's just utterly destroyed everything else. And I do worry that, you know, I mean, honestly, Bob, we're talking about Birdman here, right?
That's exactly what we're talking about, Brad. Did Birdman ruin movies?
Well, you know what I mean? Like, Birdman is this conversation of, like, are we going to produce art, or am I just going to make a buck and be adored by fans for making smutty, just you know, superhero garbage?
So I'll jump in here because that's not what I want to do. Like, I don't want to just shit on superhero movies. I think they're enjoyable, and I think, like, for what they are, they're no different than any other what you'd call popcorn movie. You know what I mean? Like, they are today's Indiana Jones. They are today's what have you. Fill in the blank with your summer blockbuster movie. But the trend that we've really seen with superhero movies is that I think they've kind of turned moviegoers and the consuming public into, like, a plague of locusts. Like, they are designed for you to consume as quickly as possible and then immediately forget about. Like, there is no further reflection on those movies. Like, the only one that really sparked any real conversation was Black Panther. And it's funny because I often hear people talk about, like, was Black Panther really as good as people make it out to be? And, like, that's a question for another day. But I think that some of the underlying themes in Black Panther did a fantastic job of at least sparking critical reflection on that movie. But what I see happening with superhero movies is that because Marvel built the MCU a certain way, it's like we're watching a 20-chapter TV show that's just costs hundreds of millions of dollars. It's serialized.
And makes billions and billions of dollars.
It does. And that's not to say that any of these things are bad, but the way that studios are thinking now is every property that comes across their desk becomes, can this become a franchise? Not like, can this become a really successful standalone movie that will shatter records everywhere,
or even like that trilogy or something.
That kind of thing was even happening a decade ago, Brad. Like when the first Avatar movie came out, they did not immediately, like, ink a 5-picture deal for Avatar. It was just such a juggernaut at the box office that now they're making 3 sequels. And again, quality of that movie aside, we don't need to talk about that today. What I'm saying is studios do not go into the movie making business now unless they feel like something has franchise potential. And that's really scary because it's kind of eliminated what I guess you could call the middle class of movies. Like, there are huge tentpole summer blockbuster movies, and there are tiny, tiny indie films that nobody sees. And we've eliminated the mid-major budget movies. Like, there are no real romantic comedies getting made anymore. There's no movies for, like, the adult demographic getting made anymore. At least not ones that get a theatrical release. Like, I was just talking to somebody the other day about that Tom Hanks movie, You've Got Mail, with Meg Ryan. And like, that's the kind of movie that back in 1998, that movie will make you $70 million because it has Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan in it. And it only cost you like $30 million to make. Studios are not interested in those kind of profit margins anymore. And it's because of the superhero movie. It's like, either we'll give you $10 million and that's it, or we'll give you $200 million knowing we'll make $1 billion back. And so I think for me, that's the biggest concern with what superhero movies have done is it's turned everything into a franchise and it's eliminated like the different types of movies we used to get.
It's interesting because as you were talking about that, it honestly made me think about Christopher Nolan, right? That he went to Warner Bros. And said, hey, I want to make this, cool movie called Inception. And I've got this other like idea in my head about time travel and space. And I kind of want to do these cool things. And they said, okay, make us a Batman trilogy. And so he did it, and they were phenomenal and really, really well done, except for the third one. And then he got his movies. But that almost like worries me that there's this like bargain of like, okay, well, if you are willing to make a franchise for us, even if it's just like 3 or 4 movies, then, okay, well, I guess we'll let you do something that's like outside that realm. I don't know. Do you feel like you've seen more bargains like that in cinema outside of Nolan?
See, that's hard to say too, because again, like Nolan is one of those few people that have broken that mold, but he relied on superhero movies to do that. So, when Tenet comes out now, there's nobody in Hollywood that could make a Tenet now except Christopher Nolan. Like, I don't think it would get done. He just has that much clout that he has happened to become one of maybe 4 filmmakers that can sell a movie on their name alone. Like it's him, it's Tarantino, it's Scorsese, and it's Spielberg. And Spielberg is kind of falling out of fashion with younger generations even. So like it's hard to say. And I think that's what really concerns me about this whole superhero plague
epidemic
that we have now. Yeah, it really is. It's like an epidemic. And I don't dislike these movies. I dislike what they are doing to the movie business. And before we go any further than that, Brad, because we're going to have to talk about how they're affecting streaming services, I think we should drink some whiskey. Let's drown our sorrows a little bit. I want to try this Smoke Wagon straight bourbon. It clocks in at 92.5 proof. Now, this is sourced from MGP. Smoke Wagon has a really interesting backstory, Brad, where they had started sourcing this product from MGP. They were going to import it to Nevada to bottle it and things like that. And as they were getting the business up and running, Nevada passed a law that said you cannot be a distiller who distills their own product and also sources product, basically. And so they were left figuring out what to do. And as they were figuring it out, these barrels that they had gotten from MGP were just sitting there getting older and older and older and getting up to like 8 years in age, basically. So they have these barrels now. They finally worked something out with the state of Nevada. They've been blending them together. And what we have is the result of those efforts. Brad, as I nose this and take a sip of it, the first thing that really strikes me is that this drink's a lot hotter than 92.5 proof. I don't think it's harsh. I don't think it's like super alcohol forward, but like if you had told me this was 100 proof bourbon, I would have believed you.
Yeah, it has like a lot of, I don't know, it had kind of like a raisiny smell to me on the front end with a little bit of rye going on in there. I don't know if this is a high rye bourbon. But yeah, as you drink it, for me, there was a decent amount of bitterness and like a push of that spicy young rye on my palate that it didn't hit all the right buttons for me.
Oh, see, yeah, I like this, Brad. It definitely does lean more into the oak and alcohol side of things. I really like it. It leaves me with a nice kind of like vanilla cream soda note at the very, very end. And it reminds me of some other products that I've had before that were sourced, like some stuff from Lux Row, like your Ezra Brooks or your Rebel Yell. It kind of does fall into that Rebel Yell kind of vein for me, but with a little more punch to it. I like this a lot.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit cooler than you, but you can tell that it's well-made whiskey at the very least. It's just not quite my favorite flavor profile.
If you had to quantify it, Brad, where do you think you'd fall on this out of 50?
Out of 50, probably around like a 30 to 32 out of 50.
Yeah, I think I'd be a little bit higher, probably like 35. I might recommend buying this or trying it if you're out at a bar. And I think it bodes well for the 2 higher proof ones that we're going to have after this, Brad. And that's going to happen as we talk about the concept of streaming services. Now, obviously, over the last year and a half, we've seen that Netflix has lost a significant amount of its market power, market share, because companies realized, hey, if we just keep all of our IP and launch our own streaming service, we don't have to, pay Netflix these ridiculous amounts or not make as much back as we could be making. And so now you have companies like NBC has Peacock now. CBS is going all in on this Paramount Plus. You have HBO Max. You still have Netflix, Hulu, Prime Video. There are just tons and tons of streaming services now.
And as we get into this, Bob, I'm curious, what would you consider like your main streaming services that you use?
I mean, Netflix is going to always be up there just because they have so much on Netflix. And then a lot of it's just like, what my friends have that they're willing to share a password with me. You know what I mean? Like, I've never thought Hulu was worth the money, especially like the way their ads are structured, that you have to pay extra for ad free. I will say right now, I am using our friend Jen Lauer's HBO Max account, and HBO Max has quickly become my favorite streaming service, not just because they're doing this contract with Warner Brothers where they're releasing the new movies that Warner Brothers has, but they have such a wealth of classic movies. They have a deal struck with Turner Classic Movies as well. And so like half the movies we've done on this podcast are on HBO Max. They have all the old HBO shows. You've got your Sopranos, you've got The Wire. Like it's really a great streaming service. So those are probably my main two.
Yeah, on my end, my wife and I actually just got rid of Netflix. So we after like probably 3 to 4 years of having it, do not have Netflix anymore. And I almost feel like an outsider now. Like that's like the juggernaut.
It's like expected. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. However, we did get Paramount Plus. We got it actually when it was still CBS All Access. There's enough TV shows on there that we enjoyed, and they had some good movies on there that I was like, yeah, we'll just switch over to that for a little bit. And I don't want to pay for 2 streaming services. So right now we're enjoying a little bit of Paramount Plus, and we'll kind of see where it goes from there.
Well, Brad, that actually is a perfect segue into this streaming services discussion, because we found this thread on Twitter that we'll link to in the show notes. It's really worth reading. It's essentially like an essay in Twitter form. And the guy was basically talking about how Paramount Plus is hedging its bets on the idea that you will so wholeheartedly associate yourself or have fond feelings for some of their IP that you'll want to go get Paramount Plus. But they're basically saying the problem with that is that the only one that really works with is Disney Plus. Like, Disney has so perfectly cultivated a brand over the years that when you ask somebody about a Disney movie, you have an idea of like what a Disney movie is. And so Disney can group all of their stuff together and say like, you are getting Disney. And people are like, yes, I understand. But what does it mean to group a bunch of IP together and say you're getting Paramount? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, okay, I can watch Forrest Gump and like SpongeBob SquarePants. Like, is that enough for people to give you $10 a month for? And I'm not saying that the content on there is bad or anything.
Don't forget all of their crime dramas. You got CSI, NCIS, Blue Bloods.
Well, that's what I'm saying is like, I'm not saying that the content is necessarily terrible. And if you like watching, crime dramas made for 60-year-olds, Paramount Plus is your shit. But
it really is.
But I think it asks a really good question, which is like, are these companies being really short-sighted? Because Brad, there has to come a breaking point where we're all paying just as much for streaming services as we were all paying for cable. And I don't have an association or an attachment to a lot of these brand names like they think that we do.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it, there was like this golden era of Netflix when Netflix finally had like content worth watching and just had a massive catalog. And there was nobody else out there. Mm-hmm. Like there was Hulu for a while. But once again, they were more about live TV, and they were more about, you paying them money and then still having to watch ads unless you paid them more money. And so Netflix just really had command on the market, and you could get a massive amount of stuff. Now, I don't know, man. It's just hard because you look at it and you go, well, yeah, like these companies are going to want to make money off of their own stuff, and they don't want to have a cut of that money taken away by Netflix or Hulu or anybody else.
Right.
But at the same time, like, man, you can get YouTube TV right now, but it's like $65 a month, which is just as much as cable.
Yeah, exactly.
So for me and my family, we were just kind of like, we are only going to pay for one streaming service at a time. And if we miss out on some stuff, then, okay, we missed out on a little bit of content that I would forget a year from now anyways.
Exactly. Well, and that, again, Brad, like, talk about another perfect transition. We were talking about this whole thing that went down a couple months ago with Martin Scorsese talking about superhero movies. Some of you will remember this. They asked Martin Scorsese what he thought of Marvel movies or superhero movies in general, and he basically said he didn't consider them to be cinema. And that sounds like the most pretentious thing ever, and it did come across that way. He talked about how they remind him of a roller coaster ride. And I think that when they first asked him what he thought of superhero movies, he didn't really put his thoughts together well. And then about a month ago, he wrote an article for the magazine Harper's that was supposed to be like a commemorative article honoring the Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini. And he used the intro to that article to just talk about basically what he thinks of superhero movies and streaming services and how they're interconnected and how they're both basically ruining, for him, cinema. And Brad, I don't know, it's a pretty long quote. Do you want to read the quote? Do you want me to read the quote? And then let's talk about it.
Yeah, I'll pull it up. We're about to get a beautifully long quote from the director who gives us the longest films known to mankind, Martin Scorsese. Flash forward to the present day as the art of cinema is being systematically devalued, sidelined, demeaned, and reduced to its lowest common denominator, air quotes, content. As recently as 15 years ago, the term content was only heard when people were discussing the cinema on a serious level, and it was contrasted with and measured against form. Then, gradually, it was used more and more by the people who took over media companies, most of whom knew nothing about the history of art form, or even cared enough to think that they should. Content became a business term for all moving images, a David Lean movie, a cat video, a Super Bowl commercial, a superhero sequel, a series episode. It was linked, of course, not to the theatrical experience, but to home viewing, on the streaming platforms that have come to overtake the movie-going experience, just as Amazon overtook physical stores. On the one hand, this has been good for filmmakers, myself included. On the other hand, it has created a situation in which everything is presented to the viewer on a level playing field, which sounds democratic, but really isn't. If further viewing is suggested by the algorithms based on what you've already seen, and the suggestions are based only on subject matter or genre, then what does that do to the art of cinema? Curating isn't undemocratic or quote-unquote elitist, a term that is now used so often that it becomes meaningless. It's an act of generosity. You're sharing what you love and what has inspired you. Algorithms, by definition, are based on calculations that treat the viewer as a consumer and nothing else.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack there. Thank you for reading that, Brad. There's a lot to unpack there. But basically what he's getting to is streaming services, superhero movies, the lack of a theatrical experience are all tied together, and they're making things worse. And what he's really going in on here is the idea of the algorithm, the Netflix algorithm, whatever you want to call it, where when you watch one true crime documentary, all it suggests to you forever is true crime documentaries. And you fall down the rabbit hole, much like you would on YouTube. And Scorsese, what he's saying here is basically like, we are missing out on the concept of curating, or like when you used to go into a Blockbuster and you trusted the guy behind the counter and you said like, what's good here? And he would say like, if you like this, maybe try this. It's not the same thing, but it's from, the same actor, whatever it might be. And they would piece something together for you. Whereas with Netflix, it's basically just like, oh, do you like things that hit these different parts of our algorithm? Then we trust that you'll like this. And what that does is it never allows you to really broaden what you're experiencing, what you're taking in. And I think I really agree with Scorsese here. It's all content. All they care is that your eyes are on the screen at all times. It's designed to keep you sucked in, and they do that by developing an algorithm that only gives you things they already know you like. And I think that is kind of dangerous, Brad, because it means that people are never going to get exposed to anything outside of that.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts here, Bob. My first one is actually a little bit of debate coaching for you. Never use Blockbuster in the positive to try and make your argument sound better. Just,
That's fair.
Just a thought.
That's fair.
You know why we should curate more often? Because the Blockbuster guy used to do it for us.
Well, I mean, if you're nerdy like me, then you had movie nerd friends that you trusted. But I don't know how many people back, even back in the day were calling somebody up and being like, curate a movie-going experience for me. You know?
No, honestly, Bob, I think that, I don't know if you've had this thought yet, but you have literally curated a movie content experience for me and by extension, anybody who listens to this podcast, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's true.
You sat down and you said, man, Brad's seen some movies, but he needs to see a lot more. And here I am. I mean, what are we at? 130, 140 movies later? And my cinematic experience has been expanded. And I will say that some of it I have not enjoyed at all. There's things like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind that just didn't click for me. And then there's other things like Silence of the Lambs, which I 1,000,000% would never have watched on my own. And I am so incredibly thankful that you forced me to watch it for this podcast that we do.
Yeah.
So I think that that's kind of the key of what you're getting at. And honestly, what Scorsese is getting at is that if humans aren't pushed to get up off of their quote unquote comfort zone and get up off the couch and go watch something that challenges them, that these algorithms are built to turn us into the humans from WALL-E.
Oh, for sure.
Right? We are supposed to turn into these humans that just consume any content. It could
unthinkingly.
be. Yeah. Yeah. And it could be, neo-realist Italian film from Federico Fellini.
Right.
But if that's the only thing we ever watch and we never move on from that, then I think what he is saying is that makes us lazy, fat viewers, right? And I say fat with air quotes.
Yeah. No, I think you got it, man. And that's why I agree with Scorsese. And I know that when you just see the pull quotes on BuzzFeed or whatever, it sounds pretentious. But
when BuzzFeed pulls from Film and Whiskey.
Yeah, exactly. I meant from Scorsese.
I know.
Hey man, let's drink this second whiskey. We're getting into the small batch bourbon from Smoke Wagon. This is 100 proof. And Brad, I think this really does kind of up the ante in every way. This is definitely a more well-rounded experience. I don't know how to explain it. I feel like, when someone talks about a band that's really in their groove and they talk about being in the pocket, this seems in the pocket to me. All the notes on the nose are there in the flavor. I got a really, really great Pepsi Cola note on the nose. I thought it was much more cola sweet on the flavor. It still has that oak to it. It's not sickly sweet, but this one definitely seems like a more consistent experience throughout.
Yeah, there's definitely a little bit more of that traditional bourbon sweetness that I'm getting on the nose, on the palate. For me, there was a little bit of a crisp green apple kind of a taste, which
I can honestly see that. Yeah, it's kind of bright at the end.
Yeah, it's a little bit bright. And honestly, as I think about the green apple flavor I'm getting, it actually does kind of remind me of a really refreshing cola on a hot day, right? That it's a little bit bright, it pops, it hits you in just the right ways. It's once again, it's a little bit more bitter. I don't know if that's just Smoke Wagon's thing, is that they have that little bit of bitterness from a high rye bourbon. So that's kind of pulling it back for me just a little bit again. But this one is a much more consistent experience that I would definitely recommend.
You're right, Brad. It definitely is hitting this one particular part of my palate where every single time, I go to swallow and it just kind of, there's a note of almost a grassiness to it. And then the very last thing I get as I kind of breathe out again is that nice, crisp brightness at the end, like a green apple. But it definitely takes away from the sweetness overall. So yeah, maybe this is a characteristic we're going to see in all three of these. I am picking up on some of that kind of bitter grassiness, though.
Yeah, the way you said it, grassy, that it clicked for me when you said that. It kind of has that green tea, grassy, little bit herbal bitterness to it that it's not totally my jam, but it's not too bad.
Well, while we're here, Brad, let's just go ahead and try this uncut, unfiltered. This is the one that people are going crazy for. The batch that we have clocks in at 112.08 proof. The proof points range, up to the 120s, I think I've seen before. It's definitely barrel proof. It's definitely strong. You can't find it anywhere. It's in demand. And so I think that we owe it to our listeners, Brad, to give this bad boy a try. What has this increase in proof done to this product, Brad? What do you think?
Well, honestly, I want to express a noob question about whiskey to you or to, honestly, whatever next guest that we have, and I'm fine with embarrassing myself. Do they really know that this is 0.08 proof? Like, who's to say it's not 0.09 proof or 0.07? Like when they give like 112.5, I'm kind of like, okay, yeah, sure, it's halfway between proofs. But are they really able to tell the proof down to the 10th position?
So that's a really good question. And I think at a place like MGP that's making this, that they definitely can tell it with that level of precision. They have like kind of crude instruments that work kind of like barometers that you submerge it in the alcohol. You see how much it tells you the proof basically. But that's a little bit more like reading an outside mercury thermometer. But they also, and I've seen them do this before at places like Maker's Mark, if you go to the lab there, they'll take different samples from different barrels and they put in a little vial, and a machine will tell them exactly what percentage, like down to decimal points, is alcohol. And so I don't know if that's the case at like really small distilleries or if they're kind of rounding numbers, but at a place like MGP, I have to imagine that they have the infrastructure to have like a machine that can tell them to the second decimal what the proof would be.
Okay, I'm in. I was questioning a little bit, but I am a believer in all things scientific.
Well, on that note, Brad, what are you picking up here on this Uncut Unfiltered?
Bro, you have the best way of just being so obvious about your segues from my ridiculousness back to what you wanted me to originally talk about.
It's called reining you in, my friend.
Oh, man.
No, actually, honestly, Brad, I think that was a really good question. And like the production side of things is honestly where I think both of us still have the least amount of knowledge about the whiskey making process. And part of that is just because like they don't really advertise that to the public a lot. And so I'm pretty sure I was watching a show like How It's Made or something where I saw them do this thing with the vials and feed it into a machine. So like I know they do it. I've never seen it done with my own two eyes. And I think it's a perfectly valid question to ask, like, why this level of specificity on the proof point?
Yeah, well, next time we get down to Kentucky for a distillery tour, I'm going to ask that question to every single master distiller that I meet.
Boom.
And it'll be great.
All right, man, let's drink this freaking whiskey.
So as I get into this whiskey, I feel like it is a rougher and yet somehow tastier version of the 100 proof.
Yeah.
Like you definitely can, like, I don't know. The best way to describe it is it's definitely uncut and unfiltered. Like there's a difference in the flavor that you can tell it's a little bit higher quality, that they've spent some time with this, but it still has that oakiness. There's still that little bit of a grassy bitter note that at this point I'm just going to say is a part of their lineup. You lose a little bit of that nice sweetness from the 100 proof, but honestly, I don't mind. I am really enjoying this uncut, unfiltered.
So I don't know if I'd say that you lose the sweetness, but the increase in alcohol, even though it's only 12 proof points, the alcohol is front and center here. This reminds me a lot of an Elijah Craig barrel proof where you get like some very upfront alcohol tingle on your tongue, not just, on the finish as you swallow. This is definitely the most caramely of the three. And obviously, caramel, whatever you want to call it, is the most prominent bourbon note, aside from maybe vanilla. But when I smelled this, it had just a whiff of that cola that I got on the first two. But it was almost like if you could make a butterscotchy cola, that's what this was. It was like butterscotch, caramel, melted ice cream topping, and soda to like if a root beer float had butterscotch ladled over the top of it. That's kind of what I got on the nose here. I still don't know if I agreed that it loses the sweetness. I do think maybe the alcohol overwhelms the sweetness a little bit, and it kind of, for me on the finish, it doesn't really leave a lot of flavors behind. It's almost like it wipes your palate clean every time. I would like a little bit more of that kind of lingering sweetness, but Brad, damned if I don't like this a lot. And on that note, too, I think all three of these whiskeys drink differently from each other, which you really do want in a line of whiskeys. You don't want it to be just the same thing at a higher proof point. I thought that 92 proof, it reminds me a lot. I can't quite remember if it's like a Luxco product or if it's something like a 1792 small batch, it reminds me a lot of one of those. It really does fall right in that wheelhouse of like 92 to 94 proof bourbons. I liked it a lot. The 100 proof, a little bit more sweet, a little bit more kind of cola forward. This 112 uncut, unfiltered is just like a butterscotch and caramel bomb for me. And I like this one the best.
Honestly, dude, I think my palate was just fucking shot.
Yeah.
Like, I had some pizza, and I haven't eaten pizza in like 3 or 4 months at like 6 or so tonight.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like right beforehand, but I think that all the like salt that I'm not used to eating, I honestly think that it just kind of wrecked my palate because I didn't get any sweetness at all on the third one.
Well, there you go. Film in Whiskey Nation. Don't eat pizza immediately prior to a whiskey tasting.
Hey, I mean, it was like 2.5 hours ago. All right?
That's true. All right, Brad, let's answer our last question here, and we can do this kind of quickly, I think. You know, as a guy who doesn't go to the movies a lot, Brad, I feel like you can be very objective about this. Are movie theaters dead? Like, is this it? Is this where we're going to see the slow decline of movie theaters in a blockbuster type fashion?
Yeah.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Which
I
really
hate it.
Fucking sucks, man. Because going to the movies, I mean, again, you know me. I am so passionate about movies, but going to the movies is an experience that when those lights go down, it is just exhilarating. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you can't replace that.
You can't. I mean, the only way you can replace it is if you're a millionaire and you build your own like 20-seater theater in your basement.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, it's highly unlikely that you're going to have a screen that is the size of a movie theater screen.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you, dude, the decline of movie theaters started for me in probably about like, I don't know, 2014, 15, 16, when Cinemark started installing those asinine reclining chairs. And
I can't stand those things, man.
I hate them because their old ones were so comfortable. And now, granted, Bob and I both live near Cinemark Valley View, which was, when it was built, one of the 3 largest Cinemarks in the nation, which I don't know, man. I always thought that was wild to be in Cleveland, Ohio, right?
Right.
However, the seats that they had in there were hands down the single most comfortable seats I think I've ever sat in my life. And then they started... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I hate to interrupt you. Like, I completely agree. And for me, it's one of those situations where a whole industry completely misreads the trend. 2013, 2014, they saw that Netflix was getting popular. They saw that people wanted to watch movies at home, that they didn't want to go out anymore. And instead of doing what they should have done, which was reduce ticket prices in order, make a smaller profit margin in order to keep people coming, what they did was they continually increased prices. They continually got more gimmicky. Like, there's some Cinemarks that have this seat in it called I think it's called D-Box. And it's like a vibrating chair. It's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. It's like $18 to sit in this stupid chair. And for the rest of them, what they did is they ripped out traditional movie seats and said, well, if they want a home-like experience, let's put Lazy Boys in the fucking theater. And they lost 2/3 of their capacity installing these, like you said, asinine chairs. I hate these freaking chairs. You can't move up and down the aisle. People are like, they give you dirty looks if you have to go to the bathroom because they have to slowly put their feet down to let you by. It's just like they completely misread what people wanted out of movies. No one hates going to the movies. We hate paying $15 to go to the movies.
Yeah. And that's what it really comes down to. And you could talk about this for a lot of different things. Like, we could have done this entire episode on trying to get into an NFL football game. Like, the amount of money that you're going to spend to sit in the nosebleeds of a Cleveland Browns football game after they went 10-6 and made the playoffs. I mean, it's just going to be asinine.
Yeah.
And nobody's going to want to do that when you can sit in your house and watch it in the comfort of your own home. So what do you do to bring people in? Lower the prices and get people into the theaters. And I know that by installing the ridiculously large Lazy Boy seats, they technically have less seats in the theater. Therefore, the percentage of their capacity goes up, right? Like...
Well, you're right. What I meant was like, they had 300 seat auditoriums. They ripped them all out and they can only fit 60 chairs in there now.
Yeah.
And in order to compensate for that difference, you have to raise ticket prices again.
Exactly. And so I don't know, man. I just think about the in-theater experience. And I'll be honest, I have not gone to the movie theaters very often in the last 4 to 6 years. Like, I'm pretty sure that Jojo Rabbit was the last movie that I paid for to go see in theaters. And that was like on a whim for my birthday. I was just like, I don't know. I want to go see a movie and this Jojo Rabbit looks good. And it was just like on a whim. And I hadn't been to a movie in almost a year.
Yeah.
And that's sad to me because like some of my favorite, just absolute favorite memories in childhood revolve being in the theaters. I remember in 2003 being in the theaters, sitting among strangers because my family could not find a seat together to watch Frodo finally destroy the One Ring. Like, seeing The Return of the King in theaters was just this beautifully magical experience. I remember going to watch Revenge of the Sith in theaters. I skipped school to go see this movie. We were so excited for, the conclusion of this Star Wars saga. And like, I don't know, man. It just makes me really sad.
Yeah, me too. And again, like, I think it's too far along now to turn the ship back. And the pandemic has just accelerated everything we're talking about. Like the rise and eventual crash of streaming services, that has accelerated. And the decline of movie theaters has just completely accelerated. And they had the opportunity because they could see the market research that said the average person is only going to the movies 2 times a year now. And instead of saying, well, let's democratize this a little bit, let's make it a ticket cost less so that more people can come to the movies, that it's not cost prohibitive anymore. They doubled down on everything that people hated, and they have just completely driven themselves out of business. And it sucks because there is just nothing like I remember I went to go see Django Unchained on Christmas Day, or maybe the day after Christmas. And
Christmas movie.
The theater was packed. And I had to sit like on an aisle way back up in the back of the theater, basically. And I had heard about all the controversy about the movie. I had no idea what the atmosphere in the movie theater would be like. It was one of the best experiences I've ever had. There's nothing like when a movie is just firing on all cylinders and you are just in a room full of strangers. There's an electricity that all of you share. And I mourn the loss of them preemptively for people like our kids, Brad, who really probably won't grow up going to the movies that often. It's just, it really was like America's pastime for 100 years. And we have just very, very rapidly dissolved that.
Well, and it comes back to the curation conversation, right? That in the end, comfort is destroying the average American's cinema, like, not experience of like an individual movie, but the experience of cinema as a whole. That like, if you get really deep in on superhero movies, then that's all that's going to get suggested to you. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not pushed out of your comfort zone a little bit to enjoy yourself, you're not going to actually find the experience as enjoyable. Like it's not as much fun or as rewarding to watch movies in your home as it is to go see it in theaters. And why? Because you have to work for it. You got to go pay a little bit of money. You got to drive. You got to get dressed up. You can't just sit there in your boxers. And you have to watch it around a bunch of other people. And you have to worry about like...
So you really can't wear just boxers.
Yeah.
Let us emphasize again. Please wear pants to the movies.
Please wear pants in public, in general.
Yeah, man.
But I don't know. I feel like we're just like two old geezers. And I want to remind the world that Bob and I are born 9 days apart and we are 30 years old. So we're not like 72-year-old farts that are just like, whoa, back in my day, the theater.
I mean, we are doing back in my day, but I think it's worth, if we're both being honest and
it's worth back in my daying about.
It's worth back in my daying about because I think if we're being honest and we're reading, what's in the cards here correctly, it's going to happen. And I mourn the loss of it. And so, like, if you want to get at us and call us old geezers, I would love to hear what Film and Whiskey Nation thinks about all three of these questions. Like, what are superhero movies doing to movies in general? What are streaming services doing to movies in general? What's going to become of movie theaters in the next 5-10 years? If you'd like to answer any of those questions, if you'd like to just call us old farts, please do. You can find us on social media at Film Whiskey.
Well, and I want to point out one last thing, is that Bob is like kind of more of a high movie critical thinking kind of person that not everybody can relate with. I would call myself a pretty average movie going person. Like, obviously, I've watched a ton of movies for this podcast, and I've grown in my ability to critique and think about movies. But for the most part, I feel like I still can represent the common man, and I'm with Bob on this, 100%. So yeah, if you think that we're just whacked out of our minds and that we need to pull back on the whiskey a little bit, call in and leave us a voicemail. You can check us out on anchor.fm/filmwhiskey.
All right, we will be back on Monday with another regularly scheduled episode. I promise all of our bonus episodes won't just be us bemoaning the state of things.
They will be just as angsty about this.
Oh, man. All right, we'll see you all on Monday for another regularly scheduled episode. Until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.